Everybody. I assume this microphone is working just the way it's supposed to work. Sounds like it. Thank you for coming out on this very rainy, dreary evening. We're going to be talking, as Jan was saying, boy, you can't. Let's see. Let me put it up a little higher. Okay. Right there. Is that better? Not much. Let me instead then, if I use this microphone, that better? A little bit? I got to lean into the microphone, and that's better? Okay, that's what we'll do. Thank you for that feedback. The title of this presentation, or first of all, about myself, I'm trained as a philosopher. I do medical ethics and healthcare policy. Most of my teaching is with medical students and medical residents, just so you understand that. Occasionally I do a graduate seminar with the philosophy students at Michigan State University. Many of you may be familiar with the fact that the College of Human Medicine has one of its clinical campuses here in Midland. So I think that's something you should want to know. We're going to be talking about genetics and some of the ethics issues raised in connection with reproductive decision making this evening. I want to start off by calling your attention to a couple premises for the presentation this evening that come from a writer, a scientist named Philip Kitcher. He says, we are beyond the age of genetic innocence. We've entered, and we can't exit, the age of genetic responsibility. If you understand those two premises, then you're going to understand everything else that we're talking about this evening and why we have ethics and public policy issues here. I have 3 children. They were born in the 1970s. That was the age of genetic innocence. I had nothing to say about what their genetic endowment was going to be. It was going to be a matter of chance. But for my children, some of whom already have children, they had the option, if they wanted, to make some choices regarding the genetic endowment of their children. Now, most of the time, parents have no strong reason why they would want to alter the genetic endowment of their children. On the other hand, part of what we've learned, in part as a result of the Human Genome Project, is that we're able to identify ahead of time genetic vulnerabilities that individuals have to heart disease, to cancer, to Alzheimer's, to cystic fibrosis, to lots and lots of terrible diseases. And it may be the case that there's not very much that we can do by altering that fact about any of us who are already somewhat advanced in age. But in terms of future possible children who would be vulnerable to some of our own genetic deficiencies, today we have the technology that would allow us to make choices there rather than to allow that to be a matter of chance. And so one of the ethics issues that comes up is whether or not this is something that should be what you might call a pure choice that individuals have, or is it a choice that individuals, couples, would be morally obligated to make when it's the case that they know ahead of time that they pose a risk to the future health of the children that they would hope to have. So that's one of the basic issues that we're going to be talking about here. So here's a case to illustrate the sort of thing we're talking about. Here's Mr. H. He's 26 years old. And one of the things that he knows is that his father died of Huntington's disease. And you have a couple slides there of what Huntington's is all about. It's a neurodegenerative disorder. The typical onset is in somebody's early 40s. And it has usually a 10-year course, maybe a little bit longer. Individuals first lose areas of the brain that are associated with motor control. So the disease used to be called Huntington's chorea because individuals had these kind of weird movements that were associated with the disease because they lost control of the motor areas of their brain. But then it gradually moves on to forms of dementia and paranoid states. And the end that individuals are faced with is really something very, very awful. So this is something that Mr. H witnessed. And one of the things he knows is because Huntington's is a disease that is genetically dominant as opposed to being recessive, there's a 50% chance that if he has the Huntington's gene, he will have the same fate as his father. So he asks himself, do I want to know? We have a test for Huntington's. We can tell you yes or no. You have it or you don't. And so that's something that he could find out for himself. And so one of the ethics issues that we raise is this. Does he have a moral right to be genetically ignorant of his own future? Especially if he were, in effect, to think about this very carefully and say to himself, you know, if it turned out that I was positive for the Huntington's gene, I would become seriously, irreparably depressed. Nothing could change that. I would know my fate, and it would be an awful fate, and this would just color the rest of my life. As I think about it, I'm better off not knowing. That way, my ignorance will allow me to have more quality and enjoyment in my life, just not knowing my fate. We'll wait and see what happens as I get closer to age 40. So we ask, does he have a moral right to be genetically ignorant? And in general, you know, if I ask any of you whether or not you would agree with his choice, the vast majority of you, because I've actually done this with audiences, would say, yeah, of course. It's his life. He can make those choices for himself. He has the right to do that. But then there's a follow-up question. He would like to get married, and he would like to have children. And so then the follow-up question is, does a future possible spouse have a moral right to know that he has a 50% chance of himself being afflicted with Huntington's? And of course, if he has Huntington's, then his future possible children would have a 50% chance of having Huntington's. So is this the sort of thing that a future possible spouse would have a right to know? Now, this is the kind of moral conflict that we talk about in medicine today and in healthcare ethics. Because on the one hand, we want to say Mr. H clearly has a right to privacy. He should be able to keep healthcare genetic information about himself to himself. He shouldn't have to reveal that to anybody else. It's no one else's business, we might say. On the other hand, this is a marriage, and so this could have some adverse impact on a spouse, and certainly could have adverse impact on the lives of those future possible children. And that's a harm that's avoidable, and that perhaps a future possible spouse ought to have a right to make a choice about. In the marriage vows, you're familiar with the phrase, for better or for worse. Except that when those words are uttered, they're usually uttered meaning that I'm entirely ignorant of whatever kinds of problems you or I might have over the course of this marriage, but we'll deal with them. But it looks like it's morally different when it's the case that an individual knows some future fact about themselves that would affect the quality of a marriage and the quality of choices that might be made with regard to future possible children. So I've asked you to think about Mr. H. Just sort of formulate an answer in your own mind as to whether or not he has to reveal that to a future possible spouse. And then I have some other examples up there on the slide. So there's the Brca1 mutation that is associated with breast cancer. Any woman in this audience over the course of a life has a 12% chance of having breast cancer. 1 out of every 8 women in the United States will find themselves with breast cancer. If you have the Brca1 gene, your risk of breast cancer, depending upon which of the 750 genetic variations of the breast cancer gene you have, your actual lifetime risk will be somewhere between 40 and 85%. We can't tell you by even knowing which variant you have, whether you're going to be closer to that 40% end or closer to that 85% end. It's unknown. this again is something that would represent a vulnerability as well to future possible children. What about if you have a genetic vulnerability that is associated with bipolar depression disorder or early onset heart disease in your 40s, say, as opposed to 70s, or a somewhat earlier onset of Alzheimer's? So there's a gene called ApoE, the 4/4 variant, that's associated with the onset of Alzheimer's, usually in your mid-60s, okay? Are those things that if you were to know them today on the basis of genetic testing, are those things you would have to tell a future possible spouse about? And of course, when you say future possible spouse, emphasize the word possible because they may never be actualized as a spouse once you inform them of that. And that may be an outcome that you very much dread. So how should you deal with that? Oh, now among the disorders that you might have to deal with is something that's called hypertwittering disorder. Whoa! Would you worry about that one? Is that something that a future possible spouse should know about? Did Ivanka know about that? You can read that slide for yourselves. What are some of the values that are at stake here? What we think of as ethical and or social political values. Genetic privacy, I mentioned. Procreative liberty. In general, we think of ourselves as belonging to a free society. Individuals make their own choices. Couples make their own choices about whether to have children, how to have children, whether to take advantage of some of these alternate reproductive technologies that medicine makes available today. That's procreative liberty. Does procreative liberty include your right to make choices today about the genetic endowment of your future possible children? There's the issue of genetic responsibility at the personal level. What are your obligations if you know that a future possible child of yours, if you do nothing, just sort of roll the dice and see what happens, would have a risk of early onset heart disease or early onset Alzheimer's or some other comparable disorder or some form of cancer? And then what about genetic responsibility at a social level? Because it's one thing to say, well, there are choices that you and I and other citizens can make as individuals, but it may be the case that there have to be social policies that would facilitate, in some way or another, your ability to effectively make those choices. We're going to have some examples of that in a few slides. Another ethically relevant perspective is the best interest of future possible children. Parents want to act generally for the best interests of their children, and we let parents decide what they regard as the best interests of their children. So what are the obligations, the ethical obligations of parents when it comes to having the ability to make decisions about the genetic endowment of their future possible children? There's the issue of the general welfare of society, the costs that are associated with avoidable genetic disorders that, once they become real, have significant cost to society in terms of our healthcare system. There's the issue of healthcare justice. Who should pay for, ultimately, the costs associated with either taking advantage of these new reproductive technologies or the cost of not taking advantage of them, and children or later adults having various kinds of serious, costly health disorders that could have been avoided. And then there's the rights of persons with disabilities and whether those rights and their sense of dignity is in any way threatened by some of the kinds of choices that are available today. So here's another case to think about. A couple knows they're at risk for having a child with Fragile X syndrome. Fragile X syndrome is the most common form of what we think of as a cognitive deficiency of one kind or another. They want to have a child of their own, but they don't wish to impose the risk of Fragile X on that child, and so they want access to some non-standard form of reproduction. Or the other example that's on the slide there is if the couple's at risk for cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis is a recessive disorder, and you see the picture there that depicts what cystic fibrosis is about. It's a lung disorder, And in the case of cystic fibrosis, it's recessive, so that means each of those individuals would be a carrier of a mutated CF gene, and there's a 1 in 4 chance that they would have a child with cystic fibrosis. But they want to avoid that. They don't want to roll the dice for a 25% chance of a child with cystic fibrosis. Oh, wait a second. Hang on. Let me turn off this microphone, because that's just going to get in the way. So, how should we think about this couple and their decision-making from a moral point of view? Should they be morally commended for making a difficult but genetically responsible decision? That is, are they to be commended for trying to avoid the expense and the heartache that would be associated with their actually having a child with cystic fibrosis? Or should this couple be morally criticized for making a decision that, from the point of view of advocates for persons with disabilities, would be seen as being invidiously discriminatory? That is, advocates for persons with disabilities would, in effect, say, you're saying to the rest of the world, we don't value children who are born with cystic fibrosis or Fragile X, or you can name any of a number of other comparable kinds of disorders. And now, what's a good doctor counseling these individuals, talking to them about their options? What's a good doctor supposed to say? If the couple wants to know what sort of options are there for some alternate form of reproduction, and so what would it be, what sort of options would a physician be morally obligated to at least apprise a couple of, if not actually offer them those options directly himself or herself? If this couple wanted to access what's called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, so that they could choose an 8-cell embryo that was free of a particular genetic defect, would you see that as a morally permissible option? Why or why not? Keep in mind that part of what this technology involves is the discarding of a large number of embryos. So here's a picture of what pre-implantation genetic diagnosis looks like. And so the way it works is a woman who intends to conceive is given a drug that will cause her to hyperovulate. So instead of having one egg cell that is produced each month, she'll produce 10 or 15 of those egg cells. And then those egg cells are going to be surgically harvested. They're going to be inseminated with her husband's sperm in a test tube, so to speak, outside the woman's body. The embryos would be grown to the 8-cell stage, and actually, as I only learned today, there are some alternate versions of this which would allow the embryo to be grown to a somewhat larger stage, maybe to the 24 or 48-cell stage. And then the embryos would be, they would take 1 or 2 or 3 cells from that embryo and genetically analyze them to identify those embryos that would be free of a mutated cystic fibrosis gene, or that would be a carrier for a mutated gene, just like the parents, but wouldn't have the disease itself. And the other embryos who would have 2 copies of the gene, and so those would be future possible children who would have cystic fibrosis. So they would implant, presumably the couple would choose one of the embryos that is free of cystic fibrosis, of the mutated gene, and have that implanted. And the remaining embryos, if the pregnancy is successful, the remaining embryos which have been frozen would be kept for perhaps several years in the event that they wanted to use one of them in the future. But ultimately, those embryos are going to be discarded or destroyed. The cost of achieving a pregnancy in this way is about $40,000. And so one of the social responsibility questions that comes up is the question of whether or not those costs should be publicly financed. Insurance right now, private health insurance will not pay those costs. There are very few private health insurance plans that would pay those costs. And yet, it seems like, from some points of view, this is a responsible choice that these parents want to make. They want to avoid having a child that will have a much shortened life and a life of very diminished quality. A child with cystic fibrosis today would probably live to age 20, maybe age 30 at the outside, okay? And of course, they're going to have many, many hospitalizations to deal with the exacerbations of the disease process itself. And so should we have some kind of public financing that would provide access to this technology for parents who know they are at risk for having a child with a serious genetic disorder that would very adversely affect the length of life or quality of life of that future possible child? That's an ethics and social policy issue that I think we need to talk about. As things have been in the past, couples at risk of having children with various genetic disorders, they had to rely upon family history to figure out whether or not they posed a special risk to the children that they would hope to have. The alternative today is something called whole genome sequencing. This is literally identifying every one of the genes, looking at the 3 billion base pairs that define the genome of any one of us, and figuring out what particular genetic vulnerabilities we might have. It cost the US government $3 billion over a 10-year period of time, 1993 to 2003, to map the first human genome. Today, the genome of anybody in this room can be mapped in the space of 3 to 4 hours at a cost of about $1,000. That's how fast the technology has advanced. So that's why we have the ability to identify the genetic vulnerabilities of anybody, of children, or of future possible children. So, why would we want to have access to whole genome sequencing? Well, for any of you in this audience, you could, with whole genome sequencing, identify your risk of developing a variety of diseases. And for the most part, we are talking about risk, as opposed to what? In the case of Huntington's, the language that research scientists use is Huntington's is 100% penetrant. If you have the gene, you will have the disease. But most of the genetic disorders, all the various forms of cancer and heart disease and arthritis and so on and so forth, most of those that have a genetic connection, a causal connection, only have a probability of being expressed during our lifetime. It's more like that BRCA1 gene that I talked about earlier. And we don't really know with any kind of great specificity what that percentage is in most cases for most individuals. But among other things we can do with whole genome sequencing, we can identify current undiagnosed or misdiagnosed diseases. We can identify carrier status. Carrier status would be important if you're planning to get married and somebody else is carrying the same traits. We can identify responsiveness to drugs. So one of the things that has for a long time puzzled lots of physicians was, why does this drug for this same medical problem seem to work really well in this patient and creates all kinds of side effects in this other patient? And this has to do with the ability, the genetic features of you that determine how quickly or how slowly you metabolize a drug. So most of us are what we call normal metabolizers of a drug, and so the drug works the way it's supposed to for most of us. But if you're a fast metabolizer, then the drug goes through you more quickly, and so it has less of a therapeutic effect unless you increase the dose. If you're a slow metabolizer, the problem is that the drug increases in your body, and so it can become toxic and set off a bunch of side effects. So it would be important for physicians today to know what your genetic features are that determine how you will metabolize various drugs. Among other things we can do with whole genome sequencing, we can identify embryos that are free of genetic vulnerabilities for serious and costly diseases. So you can do whole genome sequencing on the cells of one of those embryos that we talked about with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. You can identify potential vulnerabilities of a cancer. So many of you have probably heard of precision medicine, okay? One of the things that's characteristic of precision medicine today in the field of cancer is that by looking at the genetic features of a tumor and what the genetic mutations are that drive the development and evolution of that tumor, today we can identify drugs that will, in effect, put a brake on that particular driver of a particular tumor. Those drugs are extraordinarily expensive, and they don't yield as much good as we might like at this point in time, but we have to wait and see how medicine evolves. So all this, when you talk about whole genome sequencing in this way, this all sounds very positive, and so it's not obvious that there's some serious ethical problem here, but there are some ethical problems. So here are some critical questions that you might want to ask with regard to whole genome sequencing. If part of the rationale for wanting to do sequencing is preventive, that is, we want to tell you, wow, you've got a problem, you can have heart disease, serious heart disease, by the time you're 55, unless you really, really do something about changing your diet. And the reason we, societal decision makers and or taxpayers sitting all around you there, want you to engage in these preventive efforts is because we want to make sure you don't cost us a boatload of money to provide you with bypass surgery and very expensive cardiac drugs and all kinds of other stuff like that. When if you get serious about exercise and what you're eating and so on and lose some weight, you can save us a lot of money. So prevention is supposed to be one of the advantages of whole genome sequencing. But then we ask, how confident can we be that if we spend the money on doing whole genome sequencing on individuals, that in fact would be sufficient as a behavioral motivator to get you to make the changes that will prevent some of these more serious kinds of disorders that we're otherwise faced with. Now, that little poster child there is not a good example of attentiveness to her best medical interests. And then, so if an individual has whole genome sequencing and they've been informed about their increased vulnerability to some costly chronic condition, and it can be managed if they make some changes and so on, should they be held, from a moral point of view, more accountable for having that disease or disorder than somebody who is entirely ignorant of the fact that they have that vulnerability? And by accountable, somebody could argue, does that mean that they should then be responsible for paying at least half the cost associated with treating that disease, as opposed to shifting that cost through insurance to everybody else who believes that we would have done better ourselves if we had been given that information? And then here are some other kinds of critical questions that we might want to ask. Should whole genome sequencing replace one of our current practices, which you may or may not be aware of, where we do newborn screening? Everybody who was born in Michigan since roughly the mid-1970s, babies get a little needle stick on their heel, and that's done for purposes of identifying one of 54 different, very, very, very rare disorders that will threaten the life or well-being of that baby sometime very soon after birth. But today, we have some very, very expensive drugs that for some of those disorders can be given and in effect prevent, forestall indefinitely, what otherwise are oftentimes fatal outcomes associated with those very rare disorders. But it's only 54 conditions. So the question is, why shouldn't we do whole genome sequencing, find out everything we can about the future genetic vulnerabilities of that infant? Ethically, we ask, are the privacy rights of newborns at risk if we do whole genome sequencing at birth? Or are the best interests of those infants, do those trump what would otherwise be their privacy rights? Would those concerns be mitigated if only medically actionable information were revealed from the whole genome sequencing? That is, medically actionable information that could be acted on while that child was a child and not an adult. So we wouldn't tell parents anything about the vulnerabilities of that child as an adult. And then we ask, well, what's going to count as medically actionable? I gave you one definition, but part of the problem, one of the facts that's associated with genetics and genetic testing, is that unlike if I have my cholesterol tested, whatever my cholesterol numbers are, they only tell me about me. They don't tell me about anybody else in my family. If you have a genetic test, if that infant has a genetic test, that tells you something about you, the parents. It tells you something about your siblings. It tells you something about some range of relatives. And sometimes that something may be very important from a medical point of view. And so the ethics question that arises then is whether or not parents who become aware of a particular genetic risk of a child, that may not be a risk to that child as a child, but could be a potential risk to somebody else within the family circle, do they now have to reveal those genetic facts so that others can get themselves tested to find out whether or not they have some kind of risk for a serious genetic disorder for which something can be done now, but once the disorder sets in, the likelihood of a cure or effective therapeutic intervention is greatly diminished. So that's one of the other issues that comes up here. So here's some more critical questions. If whole genome sequencing is offered to adults, then there are massive amounts of genetic information that are going to be generated for any individual. How much? 1 terabyte worth of information, okay? So a terabyte is like more than a whole encyclopedia worth of information. That's a lot of information. Right now, you know, computers that you buy have memories of about 500 gigabytes, so you would need 2 computers to hold your whole genome, 2 very good computers. So the problem is that even though we can identify all the features of your genome, one of the things we can't, and we can tell you about lots of vulnerabilities, health vulnerabilities you may have, but there's a whole bunch of other things. We're going to say, you know what? You have mutations here and here and here and here, and we know they're mutations because it doesn't match up with the normal genome that we would expect, but we don't know what those mutations mean. We don't know if this is something that could have serious health consequences for you at some point in the future. We hope to find that out someday. So then the question becomes, what's the responsibility of a physician who has to keep track of, in banks of computers, all these terabytes of genomic information on 1,500 patients, and read 20,000 medical journals in English on a regular basis to find out if there is some additional information that comes available with regard to what was a variation of unknown significance when you had your whole genome sequencing done. So this gets to be really, really complex from a medical, legal, social point of view. And what do you do in this sort of a situation? You want your sequencing done because you have a certain clinical objective in mind. You want to find out whether or not you have a vulnerability to some sort of cancer. And then what do you do when among the information, the incidental information that is generated is the fact that, well, you thought you had only a treatable cancer, but actually your whole genome sequencing shows you're vulnerable to early onset Alzheimer's. Oh, you weren't expecting that, were you? Whoops. So what's a physician supposed to do? Are they supposed to say, well, you didn't ask for this, so I'm not going to tell it to you, though you might want to make some plans differently with regard to the rest of your life if you found out you were vulnerable to an early onset Alzheimer's. Then again, you might not want to know that information. You might want to be like Mr. H and say, I would prefer not to know that. And so is a physician supposed to say to you, before you even do any whole genome sequencing, tell me about all the things you wouldn't want to know if we were to discover them in your genome. And just try to think about, mull that over in your mind for a bit, and try to imagine, as folks who don't have MDs after your name, what in the world would I not want to know about some rare or weird disease that's out there that could be in my genome, and so on and so forth. And so this gets to be, again, just from a psychological, practical point of view, very, very difficult. And then here's a nice cartoon. I'm afraid we found annoying personality markers in your DNA. I can't hire you. Whoops. That's the reason not to have whole genome sequencing. And everybody recognize Simon over there? Yep. If his DNA had been sequenced, he would not be on TV saying all those nasty things. That's what I think. Now what? So if you and your spouse have had whole genome sequencing, then what are you obligated to do with that information? Are you obligated to share that information with your spouse, especially that information that might have serious consequences for a future possible child? As a couple, are you ethically obligated to use some alternate form of reproduction that would minimize the risk of some adverse future genetic medical problem? And what should we have as a social policy with regard to whole genome sequencing for future possible parents? Would we certainly, this is we are a free society. We're a liberal, pluralistic, democratic, tolerant society. We are not going to require anybody to have whole genome sequencing, whether or not you intend to have children. We're not going to do that. But the question you can raise is, should government invest in encouraging individuals to have whole genome sequencing for their own good and for the good, to give them the information they would need to make preventive healthcare choices or to make more informed reproductive choices? Is that a way in which we should spend our tax dollars? How important is that relative to all the other healthcare needs we have in our society? I got to pay attention to the time here, folks. Morally speaking, choosing pre-implantation genetic diagnosis can be thought of as a matter of procreative liberty. Why? Because parents aren't violating anybody else's rights, free society. Parents, their intent is to act in the best interest of a future possible child. That sounds like a morally noble kind of thing to do. There is no obvious social harm associated with permitting parents to make a choice like that. But there is the issue of embryo destruction, because the vast majority of embryos created through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis will end up being destroyed. And advocates for persons with disabilities see pre-implantation genetic diagnosis as a socially approved form of discrimination against future possible persons with disabilities of various kinds. And so how should we respond? How should you respond to those concerns? To understand the moral logic behind my claim, imagine that a couple where the woman was exposed to a virus that could have potentially teratogenic effects in an early pregnancy. So her physician tells the couple they should have only protected sexual intercourse over the next 3 months, and that beyond that, it's safe. The virus will have been eliminated from her body. There's no risk to a future fetus. So, in effect, they do that, and 5 months later they conceive, and they have a child who's not affected by what otherwise would have been the adverse effects of whatever that virus was that was inside that woman. So they have made a decision to have a different child from a child that might have been conceived during that 3-month period. And the reason they didn't want to have a child during that 3-month period is that child could be born with a serious disabling condition. We don't think of individuals who would make such a choice as doing something that represents some kind of discriminatory bias against individuals with disabilities. We would, I think, instead applaud that individual as making a very thoughtful and responsible kind of choice. So, there are major moral virtues for all, it seems, that are attached to the permissibility of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Couples who refuse it are not open to moral criticism. They're not open to being called irresponsible, so long as they are thoughtful and are prepared to accept the consequences. So there are some couples that will be told, you know, if you conceive and just sort of roll the dice and don't intervene in any way, you have X% risk of having a child with Fragile X or cystic fibrosis. And they think about it and they say, if that happens, we know exactly what we will do by way of caring for that child. And we are committed. We know that this was going to, in various ways, constrain our lives. It will cost us money and so on. But we will do whatever it takes so that child has a happy and satisfying life. Okay? And so we have to respect their choice under those circumstances. And I add, society would be open to moral criticism if we reduced access to needed health care for children who needed those kinds of supportive services because the couple had made that kind of what, in their opinion, in their judgment, was a responsible choice, okay? I would also argue, though, that it would be morally wrong for a physician to fail to inform a couple who inquired what options were out there for addressing their risk of having a child with cystic fibrosis or Fragile X or whatever, if that particular physician did not tell them one of your options is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or a sperm donor or an ova donor, or there are a number of options that are out there, the physician may disagree with their choice for personal, religious reasons of one sort or another, and the physician has the right to have those reasons, but the physician may not use his or her position and the social investment that's made and social responsibility that's made in physicians. The physician may not use that position of power to deny those individuals the information that they would need. That physician doesn't have to provide them with direct access to pre-implantation genetic diagnosis if he or she is very much opposed for moral or religious reasons to that intervention, but he or she cannot deny that couple the information that they're seeking. So it's difficult to imagine then what would justify a restrictive or prohibitive policy with regard to pre-implantation genetic diagnosis in a liberal, pluralistic, democratic, tolerant society, because there is no public interest, at least any public interest I can think of, that's threatened by that option. A harder question might be whether a society could encourage the use of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis through some form of public education and so on. Excuse me, I need to take a drink of water. The goal of such a public education process would be some form of procreative responsibility. So if the cost is $40,000, then would you endorse a public policy that would mandate that such costs be covered either by private insurance or through some public financing mechanism? Here's the argument that I want to make, because that's what philosophers do, we make arguments. A justice argument can be made for public funding for couples at risk for having children who would otherwise have serious genetic disorders, and no justice argument will be made for a couple whose children are at risk for late life or midlife genetic disorders. The justice argument that supports my first claim would be these. What we're trying to do is to protect fair equality of opportunity for those future possible children, because what we think of as the opportunity range that characterizes our society for any child who's born in our society would be severely constrained for children who are born with serious genetic deficiencies of the sort I mentioned before. Part of what we're trying to do is to protect the net welfare of these children and prevent genetic harms that would reduce length of life or quality of life. And then there are efficiency reasons, because the social costs of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for the range of cases I mentioned would be quickly paid for through the reduction of costs associated with those health needs not existing. The cost of caring for a child, normal life expectancy with cystic fibrosis, will be in the vicinity of $1 million. Second claim, we're not morally obligated to pay for, through a public funding mechanism, for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis if what we're concerned about are midlife or late life disorders, because, among other things, the causal connections for affecting those disorders are very uncertain and unstable. Medicine may produce between now and 30, 40, 50 years from now some intervention that will be a lot less expensive than pre-implantation genetic diagnosis now, and efficiency arguments are going to speak against pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for these later disorders, because there's going to be very large upfront costs for which there may be a payoff, but the payoff is going to be decades into the future. Ordinarily, healthcare needs, here's some criticisms that we need to consider. Ordinarily, healthcare needs belong to a person who is actual, who's suffering, and whose suffering could be relieved through appropriate health therapies. But the kind of odd aspect of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is, in effect, instead of selecting this embryo which has 2 copies of the mutated CF gene, we select a different embryo and in effect bring into existence a different future possible person by choosing that different embryo. So we're replacing one future possible person with a different future possible person. But that was the same choice that the couple made when the woman was at risk for having, if she conceived during that 3-month period of time when she had that virus in her. So it doesn't represent a threat to the rights or interests or dignity of persons. And so how do we know that? Why do we say that? Because the argument is what in fact we're trying to prevent is not, we're not discriminating against a person with disabilities. What we're discriminating against is in effect the disabling condition. And you can illustrate that point this way. Imagine that we've developed successfully embryonic stem cell research and that we're now able to repair the devastating injuries that some individuals have suffered as a result of auto accidents or diving accidents for spinal cord injuries. And there is some research that's occurring now that is in this vicinity. The vast majority of these patients might readily embrace such a therapy, and we, society, would be wrong to withhold it from them on grounds that this represented some sort of disrespect for persons with disabilities. On the contrary, justice would require, we'd be morally obligated as a just and caring society to underwrite the costs of that embryonic stem cell therapy for those individuals with spinal cord injuries, okay? And the fact of the matter is, if individuals with those injuries freely choose to take advantage of that technology, then they obviously put more value on being restored to being able to move about in the world in the way the rest of us in this room move about, as opposed to being constrained by that injury. So then there's the issue of justice. There's no social policy should require couples at risk of having a child with a serious genetic disorder to either use pre-implantation genetic disorder to refrain from having children. That would violate the procreative liberty rights of individuals. So furthermore, a just liberal society must provide the social resources needed to maintain as close as possible fair equality of opportunity for those children who would be born with different sorts of genetic deficiencies. Couples who choose to avoid using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for religious or philosophic reasons, though, must extend the same respect to couples who would use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis in a liberal society, or who would advocate public funding for this technology. So one of the characteristics of a just society is what is called reciprocity. And so what reciprocity means is that even though I disagree with your choice to not use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and have a child with Fragile X or cystic fibrosis or whatever, even though I disagree with that choice, nevertheless, I will pay the taxes necessary to provide the social support services that your child will require. So because I'm willing to do that, I have to ask you, even though you may be religiously or morally opposed to pre-implantation genetic diagnosis because of the destruction of the excess embryos, nevertheless, I have to ask you to be equally tolerant and respectful of the choice that I would make to use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to avoid having a child with cystic fibrosis, Fragile X, and so on. A just society is one in which there are fair terms of cooperation, and that's what's expressed in the argument I just made. A liberal society is one in which there is mutual respect for diverse, reasonable conceptions of what it means to lead a good life. And such reasonable respect, such mutual respect is going to be increasingly necessary for a peaceful liberal society because of all of these emerging genetic technologies. If you're bothered by pre-implantation genetic diagnosis because it involves the destruction of so many embryos, then would you endorse doing what we might call microsurgery on an 8-celled embryo aimed at deleting serious mutated genes and replacing them with a normal copy of the gene that's supposed to be there? Over the past year, you've probably been reading about something called gene editing. And so here's picture of what gene editing looks like. And this was something that was reported just in August of this year. And these embryos were at risk for something called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a very serious kind of life-threatening disorder. It's something that was repaired at the embryonic level using gene editing technology. And so this was only done with embryos. These embryos did not become actual children. So the key to doing this is something called CRISPR-Cas9. There's actually several versions of what gene editing technology is about, but CRISPR-Cas9 is one that you may have read about in the news. And assuming that this technology can be used to edit the genes of an 8-cell embryo, then would you describe that as responsible genetics, ethically speaking? Would you encourage your adult or nearly adult children to embrace the technology as integral to responsible decision-making? And if you yourself have ethical reservations about this technology, would you want others who are ethically comfortable with this technology to have access to it for their own reproductive purposes? And so I have this quotation from the Hastings Center, which is a medical ethics think tank. Although scientists have been manipulating genetic material for years, CRISPR allows for markedly increased precision and efficiency in targeting specific genes for modification. This advancement in gene editing technology can allow for the rapid expansion of gene therapies to correct genetic disorders like Huntington's and to develop customized cancer treatments that target the unique profile of each patient's cancers. So now it's your turn to make some decisions, to engage in the kind of conversation we have to have. All of you received a piece of paper. It has some items on it, and we can do something with the proverbial show of hands, if you're comfortable doing that, to see how we might respond to those items. But rather than, in effect, soliciting right at this moment your particular opinion, I do want, if you have some questions, comments that you want to make right now, I want to invite you to ask your questions, to make your comments. Go ahead.
Question, it's an obvious one coming out of all this. How close are we to the so-called designer babies where parents can pre-select benign characteristics like red hair and blue eyes, or super characteristics like an Einstein-level IQ or a Mozart-level musical talent? And has that been discussed, and do we want to encourage that?
Well, first, it's been discussed. Secondly, what is often thought of and described as a designer baby, such as you just described a designer baby, choosing 90 different genes for this, that, or another feature of that future possible infant. This is very, very far, if ever, in the future. In some sense, there's a limit to what we can safely do by way of editing the genetic endowment of a future possible child in the way that was described in the last couple of slides here. One of the things we have to be really, really careful about is that we tend to think of the human genome is made up of somewhere around 25,000 genes that code for different proteins responsible for different biological functions in our bodies. Some of those genes do multiple kinds of things, not just one thing, not just one protein. And so the relationships among those genes and the other factors that are part of or related to our DNA and the way in which they very, very complexly interact with one another are such that we have to be extraordinarily cautious about editing at the embryonic level. At the embryonic level, the one thing that is of absolute importance from a moral, social, economic, legal point of view is the fact that when we edit an embryo, we're editing all the descendants of that embryo. And so unlike if I have surgery on my body, this has no effect on anybody else related to me. But if I had been edited as an embryo, then my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would all be potentially affected by the editing that was done on me. And so the consequences stretch very, very far into the future. And so we have to be extraordinarily cautious and careful about the sorts of things we do. So we understand what a mutated version of the cystic fibrosis gene looks like, and we know what a normal version looks like. And so we can say it's probably safe for us to replace a mutated version of the cystic fibrosis gene in embryo with a copy of the gene that's the normal copy. But if you're talking about changing 90 genes to get the so-called designer baby, that is way too risky for what sound like fashion reasons rather than a serious medical purpose. Go ahead.
The genetic testing that you said only takes 3 to 4 hours and only costs $1,000.
Yeah.
What percentage of people are choosing to do this? Is it high? Is it anybody?
It's, well, at the moment, it's a relatively small number of people. I mean, one of the very large research projects that's occurring now in the United States, and a version of it is occurring in the United Kingdom and another version in Germany and several other countries in the world, China. They're trying to get 1 million individuals to, in effect, contribute their genome to a database. And not just your genomes, but among the things that researchers want is a very, very, very complete, not just medical history, but they want to, in effect, follow you for the next 10, 20, 30 years of your life to find out and, in effect, send you a survey every 6 months, every year, saying, tell us about what you've been eating, tell us about what you've been exposed to in terms of any kind of environmental chemicals or anything, tell us about any health problems you had, tell us, because they want to, in effect, match up what's happening to you with what we know about your genome and how your genome is related to these million other ones that we're putting together. So right now, you know, we have a population in the United States of 325 million people. If I had to take what we refer to, if I had to WAG it, and WAG stands for take a wild ass guess at how many people today have probably had their whole genome sequenced in the US, it might be in the vicinity of several 100,000, less than 1 million people. I'd be very confident of that. That's about how many. But the cost, right now, I don't know that any insurance plans are willing to pay for whole genome sequencing. And even though the cost of actually producing the data for your whole genome sequence is $1,000, there are other very large costs of at least several $1,000s associated with interpreting the information that's presented, identifying those variants of unknown significance and telling you, well, there's these non-normal, non-standard features of your genome you weren't expecting to hear about. We don't know what they mean, but we're going to tell you they're there. So you can agonize and be anxious about it for the rest of your life. Yes?
How, that 23andMe and those kind of testings, $99, $100, what are they doing?
Okay, I'm repeating the question this time, and you make sure I get your question right. If you send away a swab from your cheek and ask for a genetic analysis from like 23andMe, one of these mail order companies, what are they telling you? They're doing what's called whole exome sequencing. So instead of mapping 3 billion base pairs, which is what whole genome sequencing is, they're looking at the particular coding regions, those 25,000 regions that code for different enzymes associated with different biological functions, most often with diseases of one kind or another. That's what they're reporting back to you. Now, you know, if you were reading some some of the scientific journals or just Time magazine and so on, discussing what was going on with the genome 3, 4, 5 years ago, one of the things you would have read was, gee, there's a whole bunch of junk DNA between the coding regions. And that was literally, that was the language that was used to characterize all this other stuff between the coding regions of the DNA. Well, it turns out it's not junk. They're the genetic characteristics of what's between the coding regions, among other things, is regulating how particular genes are expressed, at what time they're expressed, how they're expressed in relationship to other genes and so on, how they're expressed in relationship to various kinds of environmental insults and so on. There's lots of, so all those parts of the DNA do something, but 23andMe isn't going to tell you anything about that. You will get something from paying your $100 for the information that 23andMe would provide you with. And what you'll be told is that we identified 25 different mutations at various parts of your genome that are associated with your risk of type 2 diabetes, with your risk of heart disease, with your risk of this, that, or the other, some type of cancer, with your risk of arthritis, and so on. And you would get a percentage. You have, relative to the normal, whatever the normal individual is in our society, you have a 10% greater risk of heart disease by age 60 than the typical American, okay? And that's the kind of information you get. And so the numbers, I mean, one of the things you would ask yourself is, well, you know, what exactly does that number mean? Is having a 10% greater risk, is this something that I should sweat bullets over? Is this something that should really I should agonize over? Is this sufficient to motivate me to, say, give up my Twinkies or Suzy Q's or Reese's peanut butter cups? That's what I had left over from Halloween for the kids who didn't get it. Those are, yeah, you wouldn't, most people wouldn't know what to do with that information because you're not told it's 100%. You can, you ask, how can you use it? I mean, can doctors use it? Yeah. I mean, they can use it in the sense that they'll tell you, well, you have a 10% greater chance of heart disease by age 6. I mean, they'll tell you what would have been on a printed page. And then you'll say, but what exactly does that mean for me? And the doctor will shrug his or her shoulders and say, well, what do you want it to mean? What do you want to, are you telling me you want to minimize your chances of heart disease? You want to bring that number down a bit? Well, tell me how much exercise you do. Tell me about your diet. I'll tell you about things you can do to change your diet, to increase your exercise pattern, and so on and so forth. And, well, that'll bring the number down a little bit. It'll bring it down to 7% rather than 10. And then you ask yourself, is that worth the effort that would be required to be on that treadmill for 2 miles every morning? Would it be worth it? I mean, those are the kinds of choices you'd be faced with as an individual. Go ahead. You may have to,
how long have you and your peers been asking these questions? And from the day you started, what has been the most significant advance that you would never before have seen? The question was, how long have I and my peers in medical ethics and so on been asking these kind of questions? I started doing medical ethics way back in 1971, so that's some time ago. And in the 1970s, we were asking about the emergence of some of these genetic technologies. The first, for example, what we call test tube baby, her name is Louise Brown. She was born in 1976 through in vitro fertilization. That wasn't that long ago. But in vitro fertilization today, there are a couple 100,000 children each year in the United States who are born through in vitro fertilization. It's very common. But in the mid-1970s, when this technology was just barely being introduced into medicine, there were all kinds of scare stories about you're going to produce monsters this way. Conceiving children outside of the womb is inherently dangerous. But the physicians, Steptoe and Edwards, are the two researchers from England who did this work. They were extraordinarily cautious, and they figured out what the different problems were that they had to address before they actually conceived or helped a woman to conceive that child, so Louise Brown. And so the stuff that I talked about today is stuff that we were talking about in the 1970s. But at that time, this sounded like science fiction. And in fact, it was as little as 5 years ago that I would say to students, you hear about this stuff called gene editing and so on, but this is really some distance in the future. That was only 5 years ago. So I was really surprised by the stuff that's happening, that has happened in the past year or two with regard to, in particular, gene editing technology and whole genome sequencing and so on. The pace of our understanding of how to use this technology and so on has been extraordinarily rapid, much more because there are a very large number of researchers who are working on this stuff in part because of what they see as the promise of the technology. The promise of the technology is there. The larger social question is the question of what we're willing to pay for this technology. To give you just sort of one quick example, if I refer to something called CAR T cells in connection with cancer, is there anybody here who knows what it is I might be talking Nope. Okay, that's fine. The very edge of cancer technology today, this is for metastatic cancer, okay, so these are cancers that are going to be fatal, is something called CAR T-cell immunotherapy. This is a technology that removes the T cells in your immune system from your body, re-engineers them so that they are, after examining your particular tumors of your particular cancer, and those T cells are re-engineered so that they attack that cancer more efficiently and more effectively. One of the things that cancers do, and this again is a relatively recent discovery, is that cancers actually have mechanisms for hiding themselves from the T cells. Our immune system is designed to attack cells in our body that our immune system says, this is not you. And my cancer cells are not me. So my immune system should be attacking them. But with immunotherapy, by re-engineering the T cells and infusing them back into an individual, the T cells are now designed to, in effect, subvert the defenses of that cancer and to attack the cancer. Unlike most cancer therapies, where you have multiple infusions of a drug over a period of months or years, this is a one-shot deal. The cost of that one-shot deal is $475,000. No guarantee that this is going to cure you. It will probably give you a year or two of extra life. We can say that much now, but we don't know much beyond that, how effective it will ultimately be. And when I say $475,000, you say, wow, that's a lot of money. But actually, that's just the cost of this technology itself and the re-engineering of your personal T cells. So this is called personalized or precision medicine. The problem with the re-engineered T cells is for 70% of patients who have these re-injected into them, have this horrific reaction to the T cells called the cytokine storm that affects the brain. And this requires very, very sophisticated emergency medical care. 3 or 4 years ago, this came as a surprise to researchers. A lot of patients died who had this done to them because they didn't know how to react to the cytokine storm. Researchers now, physicians know how to react to that technology and to save those patients. Because once you get them through that hump, that event, the cytokine storm and some of the other side effects, then they're going to be okay for some indefinite period of time. But this is ICU care. It's very expensive. And so the actual cost, the total cost of providing somebody with CAR T-cell therapy is somewhere between $1 million and $1.3 million. There are 600,000 individuals in the U.S. who die of cancer every year. Whoa. So you take 600,000 and you add 6 zeros after that, that's a really big number. Who should pay for that? Should we all pay for it? What about folks who have heart disease or arthritis or diabetes, or you list all the other kinds of medical problems that are out there? How much do we want to spend on health care? I mean, that's ultimately one of the problems. Yes?
But if 600,000 people did it, when did the cost come down? Over time. I mean, right? I mean, you talk about a lot of these costs of drugs, costs of, procedures. I got to think the more and more it's used, there's some hope for future generations to afford this stuff.
You would think the cost would come down, but actually things don't seem to work that way within the healthcare system. There's a drug called Iclusig, which is a cancer drug, and the cost of that drug in 2016 was $120,000 for a course of treatment. And the drug is used, I think, with chronic myelogenous leukemia. 1 year later, in 2017, I went to check the cost of that drug, $200,000 for a course of treatment. It went up $80,000 in 1 year, and nothing changed about the drug. But in theory, there would be more patients who could benefit from it, but that did not take down the cost of the drug. And there was nothing about the manufacturing cost or additional research or anything like that. It's the same drug from a year ago. So I don't know what the logic is that drives that, but the bottom line is that the costs, it doesn't seem to matter that there are more people who get this. In healthcare, it doesn't work the way it does with computers. We have the first computer that I bought in 1982 cost me $3,000, which is the equivalent today of about $10,000 or more. And it had a total of 250 kilobytes of memory. This was, whereas now you got 500 gigabytes of memory and all kinds of other computing power and stuff computers can do for less than $1,000. That's the way the rest of the economy works. But the healthcare economy doesn't seem to work the same way. And so I would never promise anybody that the cost of these drugs or these interventions are going to come down. The technology that's associated with the CAR T-cell therapy is an extraordinarily elegant kind of technology. And so there's an awful lot of work that has to go into the re-engineering of an individual's T-cells. So I have less concern about the cost of that particular form of immunotherapy being justified by the effort for each and every case that is necessary. As opposed to, some of you may have been reading about the hepatitis C drug. It costs $1,000 a pill, okay? Yeah, that's what it costs. And you have to take a 12-week course for $84,000, but apparently it will cure you of hepatitis C if you've been infected with hepatitis C. There are about 1.2 million Americans who are, it's 3 million Americans who are infected with hepatitis C today. The actual cost of manufacturing that pill is $10. But the market will bear those costs. And Congress is not doing anything to compel, because we're a capitalistic society and you're free to charge whatever you want to charge, but there is no alternative to that hepatitis. If you want to be, there is an alternative, but it's a really ugly alternative in terms of side effects, which is why this other drug is priced where it is. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yep. In many respects, it is sad. They're doing the research is somewhat costly, but pharmaceutical companies spend more on advertising than they actually spend on research. Many of you guys already know that. I want to pay attention to the time here, folks, in the event that you got any last-minute questions you want to ask. You have that piece of paper that I passed out, that was passed out to you, and you can talk about that with your friends and neighbors and think about whether you agree or disagree with those statements and why you would be motivated to agree or disagree with those statements and so on. Otherwise, I would thank you for your time and attention. I'll stick around up here if you have any very last-minute questions that you just want to ask privately. That's okay. Thank you.